The rain wasn't falling, it was weeping. A slow, cold seep from a bruised November sky, the kind that soaked into your bones long before it darkened the shoulders of your coat. Sarah stood at the kitchen window, steam from her forgotten mug of tea ghosting the glass. Outside, the world was reduced to blurred watercolor, the skeletal branches of the maple in her tiny backyard, the sagging fence, the gray bulk of the empty house next door. It had been empty since before. 3 months. 3 months since the silence in the bungalow had become deafening. Not just the absence of Mark's booming laugh, or the clatter of his tools in the garage he'd never finished converting into a workshop, but the absence of him. The solid, anchoring presence that had filled these rooms for 15 years. Cancer was a thief, a meticulous one. It didn't just take the life. It took the future they'd sketched out on lazy Sunday mornings, the sound of his voice humming off-key in the shower, the comforting weight of his arm across her shoulders as they watched bad TV. It left behind hollowed-out spaces, and a quiet so profound it echoed. Sarah traced a finger through the condensation on the windowpane. The move to Willow Creek was supposed to be their fresh start after Mark retired from teaching. A slower pace. Gardens. Maybe grandkids visiting someday. Now it just felt suspended, like she was living in a museum exhibit of a life that hadn't quite happened. She'd packed away most of his things, but the house still vibrated with his absence. His reading glasses sat untouched on the side table. His favorite coffee mug waited, clean but unused, in the cupboard. The silence pressed in, heavier than the November damp. A flicker of movement near the sagging fence lines snagged her attention. Not the usual squirrel or scrabbling raccoon. Something lower, slower. A shadow detaching itself from the deeper gloom beneath the overgrown lilac bush. Sarah leaned closer, wiping a clearer patch on the glass. It was a cat. Not sleek, not pampered. This creature was a monument to hard living. Its fur, a patchwork of mud-streaked gray and indeterminate tabby stripes, was matted in places, hanging loose and thin over prominent ribs. It moved with a stiff-legged caution, every step a calculation, head held low, ears swiveling constantly. It looked carved from hardship. It paused near the rusted wheelbarrow Mark had left overturned last summer, intending to fix it. The cat lifted its head, scanning the yard, the house. Sarah held her breath. Even through the rain-blurred glass, she saw the eyes. Not wary, exactly. Not feral. But profoundly tired. An ancient weariness that seemed to settle in the amber depths. And then, as it turned its head slightly, the light caught something else. High on the left ear, stark against the ragged fur, was a small, distinct mark. Not a tear, not a notch from a fight. It was deliberate, precise. It was a tattoo. A tiny, faded blute. Like a pinprick of ink someone had placed there with purpose. Sarah blinked. Stray cats got torn ears, scars, maybe clipped ears from TNR programs, but tattoos? That wasn't random street life. That was ownership. History. A deliberate mark placed on a living creature. Her breath fogged the glass again. The cat lowered its head, sniffing cautiously at a pile of wet leaves, its thin frame shuddering slightly. It looked utterly defeated, drenched, alone. A creature adrift in the cold rain, mirroring the desolation Sarah felt leaching through her own walls. The sight punched through the numb fog that had settled over her. It wasn't just pity, it was a jolt of raw, unexpected recognition. I know that kind of tired, she thought, the words forming unbidden. I know that weight. The cat suddenly froze, head snapping towards the kitchen window. Had it sensed her watching? its gaze locked onto hers through the glass. For a long, suspended moment, they simply looked at each other, the woman in the warm, empty house, and the ragged creature standing in the weeping rain. No hostility, no fear, just that shared, bone-deep exhaustion. That blue dot on its ear seemed to pulse in the gray light. Then, as if the connection was too much, the cat flinched. It backed away a step, its matted fur bristling slightly. It gave one last, searching look towards the house, a look that held a question Sarah couldn't decipher, and then it melted back into the shadows beneath the lilac bush. Gone. Sarah stood rooted to the spot. The echo of the rain on the roof filled the sudden quiet inside. The mug of tea was stone cold in her hands. Mark's absence felt like a physical ache in her chest, a familiar hollow. But now, superimposed over that familiar grief was the image of those ancient, tired eyes. That small, defiant blue mark. A creature carrying its own visible scar, its own silent history, just outside her door. She looked down at her cold tea, looked back at the empty, rain-slicked spot near the wheelbarrow. The silence inside the house felt different now. Not just empty, but expectant, charged with a question she hadn't known she needed to ask. That cat wasn't just lost. It was a message, a secret standing shivering in her yard. And that tiny blue tattoo, it was the first word. Sarah moved away from the window. The numbness was receding, replaced by a low thrum of something else. Curiosity? Responsibility? A flicker of connection to something outside the suffocating walls of her grief? She walked to the pantry, the linoleum cool under her bare feet. She rummaged past half-empty boxes of pasta, forgotten cans of soup Mark had liked. Her hand closed around a small, dusty can. Tuna. Left over from some long-ago salad. She popped the pull tab. The sharp, briny smell cut through the damp air of the kitchen. It felt like an act of rebellion against the quiet, against the inertia. She found a chipped saucer, one she wouldn't miss if it disappeared, and emptied the tuna onto it. The glistening fish looked ridiculously bright against the white ceramic. Taking a deep breath, Sarah unlocked the back door. The hinge groaned, a sound that seemed unnaturally loud in the wet stillness. Cold, damp air rushed in, carrying the scent of wet earth and decaying leaves. She stepped onto the small, covered porch, the rain drumming a steady rhythm on the roof above her. The yard looked emptier, bleaker without the cat's presence. She placed the saucer carefully on the top step, just under the slight overhang, sheltered from the worst of the rain. The offering looked small, insignificant against the vast gray afternoon. She retreated back inside, leaving the door open just a crack. Enough to see, to smell the rain, to maybe hear something. She didn't sit. She stood just inside, hidden in the shadows of the kitchen, watching the saucer on the step. The rain wept on. Minutes stretched, thick and slow. Doubt crept in. It was just a stray, probably long gone. The tattoo meant nothing. Just a fluke, a weird coincidence. Her loneliness was making her see connections where there were none, projecting onto a half-starved animal. She was about to close the door, feeling foolish, when a shadow detached itself from the lilac bush. Slow, cautious. The gray cat, fur plastered even flatter by the rain, emerged. It paused, nose twitching, eyes fixed on the bright spot of tuna on the step. It took one hesitant step, then another. Its movements were stiff, wary, every muscle coiled. It reached the bottom step, stretching its neck, sniffing the air intensely. Sarah held her breath. The cat glanced towards the crack in the door, its amber eyes seeming to pierce the gloom where she stood hidden. Did it see her? Sense her? For a long moment, it hesitated, poised between hunger and fear. The rain dripped from its whiskers. Then, hunger won. With a speed that belied its earlier stiffness, it darted up the steps, crouched low over the saucer. It didn't devour the food. It ate in quick, guarded bites, head snapping up constantly, scanning the yard, the door, the sky, guarding its meager prize against invisible threats. Sarah watched, her own heart beating a little faster. She saw the prominent ribs heaving with each breath, the way the matted fur clung to its spine. She saw the mud caked between its paw pads. And as it lifted its head briefly between bites, the porch light, weak as it was in the gray afternoon, caught the small tattoo on its ear again. That deliberate, faded blue dot. A mark of belonging or a mark of loss? The cat finished the tuna quickly, licking the saucer meticulously clean. It sat back on its haunches for a moment, staring at the empty dish. Then, it looked directly at the crack in the door. Not with fear this time. Not with aggression. But with consideration? A silent assessment. Its gaze held Sarah's, unseen though she was. A strange understanding passed through the damp air, fragile as a spiderweb. This wasn't just about food. It was a first, tentative touch across a vast divide. Without a sound, the cat turned and slipped back down the steps, vanishing once more into the rain and the shadows beneath the lilac bush. The saucer sat empty on the wet step. Sarah slowly closed the back door, the click of the latch echoing in the quiet kitchen. The hollow ache of Mark's absence was still there, a constant companion. But layered over it now was something new. A quiet hum. A focus. The gray, tattooed ghost outside her window wasn't just a stray. It was a mystery. A silent, shivering piece of someone else's story that had somehow found its way to her doorstep. The rain continued its slow descent. The house was still quiet. But inside Sarah, a small, almost imperceptible shift had occurred. The stillness wasn't just emptiness anymore. It was the space before the next note. The silence held a question now, written in rain, hunger, and a tiny blue dot on a ragged ear. Something important, something fragile and profound, had just begun. The gray cat became Sarah's ghost. It haunted the edges of her property, a silent, watchful presence in the deepening chill of late November. Like grief itself, it was elusive, yet undeniably there. Sarah found herself drawn to the kitchen window, constantly. Peering out, not at the empty yard, but searching for a flicker of movement in the lilacs, a shadow near the rusted wheelbarrow. The empty saucer she'd left out, licked clean, was both a connection and a question mark. She started leaving food out, religiously. Not just tuna anymore. Small portions of leftover chicken, plain cooked rice, a shallow dish of water replaced twice a day as it froze in the encroaching cold. She placed them just inside the garage. Mark's unfinished sanctuary. She'd cleared a small space near the side door, leaving the main door cracked open just enough for the cat to slip in. It felt less exposed than the porch. Safer. For days, nothing changed. The food vanished overnight, the water level dropped, but she never saw the cat take it. The only evidence was the empty dishes, and sometimes, faint, muddy paw prints on the concrete floor, leading in and out of the shadows. Sarah felt a strange kind of companionship in this unseen ritual. It was something to do. A tiny anchor in the vast, quiet sea of her days. She started talking to the empty garage. Softly, as if the cat might be listening from the rafters. "Cold out there today, isn't it? she'd murmur, placing down the fresh bowl of water. The steam rose briefly in the frigid air. Supposed to snow tonight. You stay warm wherever you are. She'd talk about the weather, the stubborn squirrel that raided the bird feeder, the leaky faucet in the kitchen she kept meaning to fix. Mundane things. Filling the silence with sound, just as she'd once filled it for Mark during his long, quiet naps near the end. The habit was ingrained. Comforting, somehow. One brittle afternoon, a week after the first tuna offering, she saw it. Not a fleeting shadow. The cat was in the garage. Crouched low behind Mark's old workbench, a hulking silhouette of dusty tools and half-finished projects. Only its head was visible, ears flat, eyes wide, unblinking pools of amber, fixed on her as she stood frozen in the doorway, holding a small plate of shredded roast beef. Sarah's breath caught. She didn't move, didn't dare blink. The air felt charged, fragile. The only sounds were the distant cry of a crow, the drip of melting frost from the garage roof, and her own heartbeat, loud in her ears. She saw the cat's nostrils flare, scenting the meat. Its gaze flickered from her face, to the plate, then back. Calculating, weighing threat against hunger. Very slowly, Sarah lowered herself into a crouch. She placed the plate on the concrete floor, about 5 feet from the workbench. Then she scooted backwards, inch by careful inch, until she was sitting against the wall near the side door, legs drawn up. She kept her eyes downcast, focusing on a knot in the wooden floorboard. Don't stare. Don't threaten. Just be still. Minutes stretched. The cold seeped through her jeans. She could feel the cat watching her. The intensity of its gaze was a physical pressure. Then a sound. So, barely there. The faintest scrape of a claw on concrete. Sarah held her breath. She didn't look up. Out of the corner of her eye, she saw a gray shape, low to the ground, slink out from behind the workbench. It moved with liquid caution, every muscle taut, ready to bolt. It paused halfway to the plate, sniffing the air, its ragged coat trembling slightly. Its eyes darted to Sarah, then away, back to the food. It took another step. Another pause. The tension was a wire pulled tight. Finally, it reached the plate. It didn't crouch and eat immediately. It stood over the food, head swiveling, scanning the garage, the open door. Sarah. Only then, when it seemed satisfied, did it lower its head and begin to eat. Not the frantic gulping of before, but deliberate, wary bites. Head snapping up after every few morsels, amber eyes locking onto Sarah each time. Sarah remained perfectly still. She watched the rhythmic movement of its thin shoulders, the way its ears twitched at every tiny sound, the slow blink it gave once, a fleeting, unconscious gesture that seemed almost peaceful. She saw the matted fur, the dirt ingrained around its neck, the sharp jut of its hip bones. But she also saw the careful grace in its movements, the fierce intelligence in its watchful eyes. And high on its left ear, catching the weak light filtering through the grimy garage window, the tiny blue tattoo. A stark punctuation mark on its battered existence. It finished the meat, licked the plate clean with surprising thoroughness, then sat back, staring at her. Not with fear now, but a deep, profound wariness. A silent question hanging between them. What now? Sarah didn't know. So she just sat, letting the silence settle, letting the cat take her measure. The cold deepened. The light began to fade. Eventually, without a sound, the cat turned and melted back into the deeper shadows behind the workbench. Gone. But Sarah sat there, long after the cat had vanished, long after the cold had numbed her fingers. A warmth bloomed in her chest, small but undeniable. Not just the satisfaction of feeding a hungry creature, but the raw, startling intimacy of that shared silence, that shared space. For a few minutes, the crushing weight of her own loneliness had lifted, displaced by the simple, vital presence of another living being equally adrift, equally cautious. The days blurred into a fragile routine. Sarah named him, silently, in her head. Not anything grand. It felt right. Respectful of his anonymity, his wildness. He became her secret project. Her reason to get out of bed before dawn, to brave the biting cold of the garage. She bought a ceramic heater, positioning it near the food station, careful not to point it directly at his hiding spot. She bought better food, cans of pâté he seemed to prefer over chunks. She bought a soft, fleecy blanket, placing it in a cardboard box tucked into the corner behind the workbench, far from the door. She never saw him use it, but one morning, she found the blanket rumpled, bearing the faint, warm imprint of a small body. Trust grew, incrementally, measured in inches and heartbeats. Gray stopped bolting the moment she entered the garage. He'd watch her from his sanctuary behind the bench, his gaze less panicked, more observant. She kept her movements slow, predictable. She'd talk softly, telling him about the frost patterns on the window, the news headlines she'd read, the ache in her back from shoveling the first light dusting of snow. She talked about Mark, haltingly at first, then with a growing ease she hadn't felt with another living soul. He loved this garage, you know, she'd say, her voice catching on the memories swirling in the dust motes dancing in the heater's warm air. Had grand plans. A whole woodshop. Wanted to build a rocking horse for the grandkids we thought we'd have. She traced a finger over a dusty blueprint still pinned to a corkboard. Never got further than fixing that old lawnmower twice. A small, sad smile touched her lips. He was better at dreaming than doing, sometimes. But oh, how he could dream. She noticed things about Gray. He was meticulously clean, despite his rough exterior. He'd spend long minutes after eating, carefully grooming his face and paws, licking the mud from between his pads with fastidious attention. He hated sudden loud noises, a car backfiring down the street, the clang of a dropped pot in the kitchen would send him diving deep into the shadows, invisible for hours. He had a peculiar, intense focus. Sometimes, he'd sit perfectly still, staring at a patch of sunlight moving across the floor, or at a cobweb trembling in a draft, utterly absorbed. And he was quiet. He rarely made a sound. Not a meow, not a purr. His communication was all in the eyes, the tilt of his head, the subtle tension in his posture. Sarah found herself studying him, learning his language. The slow blink meant he was relaxed, or at least, not actively threatened. A slight twitch of the tail tip signaled rising unease. Ears flattened back meant he was ready to run. She learned to read the tiny shifts, respecting his boundaries. She never tried to touch him, never cornered him. The space between them, that 5 feet of concrete floor, felt sacred. A demilitarized zone built on tuna and silence. One afternoon, she brought a book into the garage. She sat against the wall, heater humming softly, and began to read aloud. Not for Gray, necessarily. Just to fill the silence with something other than her own thoughts. She chose an old novel Mark had loved. The words felt thick in her throat at first, awkward. But slowly, the rhythm took over. She read about the Salinas Valley, about loneliness and connection, about the simple struggle to exist. She wasn't sure how long she'd been reading when she felt it. A shift in the air. A presence closer than before. She kept her eyes on the page, her voice steady, though her heart hammered against her ribs. Slowly, deliberate, she lowered the book just enough to see over the top. Gray was there, not behind the bench. He was sitting just inside the pool of warmth cast by the heater, about 3 feet away from her. He wasn't looking at her. He was staring intently at a patch of sunlight on the floor near her feet, his ragged fur bathed in the orange glow of the heater. His body was relaxed loose, his eyes half closed. He was listening, truly listening. The slow blink came again, deliberate, peaceful. Sarah kept reading. Her voice softened, smoothed out. She read about the ache of the land, the resilience of the people, the quiet bonds that form in hardship. She read, and the cat sat, a silent, ragged statue in the warm light. His presence a tangible warmth against the chill of the unspoken grief that still clung to the garage walls, to her own heart. The scent of dust, old oil, warm fleece, and the faint, clean smell of the cat's fur filled the space. The only sounds were her voice, the hum of the heater, and the soft, rhythmic sound of Gray's breathing. It was the most profound connection Sarah had felt in months. Wordless, fragile, built on shared silence and the simple act of being present. She wasn't just feeding a stray anymore. She was bearing witness to this creature's quiet endurance, and he, in his own silent way, was bearing witness to hers. The loneliness hadn't vanished, but it had changed shape. It wasn't an empty void anymore. It was a space they occupied together, cautiously, each respecting the invisible walls the others still needed. The first real snow came, thick and silent, blanketing Willow Creek in muffled white. Sarah woke to a world transformed, hushed and still. She pulled on her boots and coat, breath pluming in the frigid air, and hurried to the garage, worry gnawing at her. Had Gray sought shelter? Was the blanket enough? The heater? She eased the side door open, bracing for the cold blast. But inside, the air was noticeably warmer than outside, thanks to the little heater's valiant effort. She scanned the dim space, her eyes adjusting. The food plate was empty, the water bowl half full. Her gaze swept towards the cardboard box behind the workbench. He wasn't in the box. He was sitting right in the middle of the fleecy blanket she'd left, which he'd dragged out into the open area near the heater. He was facing the side door, as if waiting. As she stepped inside, closing the door softly behind her, he didn't retreat. He watched her, his amber eyes clear, alert. His fur looked fluffier, less matted, as if he'd finally had a chance to groom properly in the warmth. Sarah moved slowly, refilling the water bowl, placing down a fresh plate of food. Gray watched her every move, but didn't flinch. He stayed on the blanket, a small island of gray fur in the concrete expanse. She sat down, not against the wall this time, but on the floor, closer to the heater, about 4 feet from the edge of his blanket. She pulled her knees up, resting her arms on them. She didn't speak, just sat, letting the quiet settle. Gray looked at the food, then back at her. He stood, stretched, a long, luxurious arc that revealed the still too prominent ribs, then patted the short distance to the plate. Steadily glancing up at her occasionally. When he finished, he didn't retreat to the shadows. He walked back towards his blanket, but instead of settling on it, he stopped. Right at the edge, closest to Sarah. He sat down, facing her, just 2 feet away now. He wrapped his tail neatly around his front paws, a picture of composed stillness. His gaze held hers, steady, unblinking. The ancient weariness was still there, but layered over it now was something else. A quiet watchfulness, a tentative curiosity. The silence stretched, filled only by the heater's hum and the faint sound of snow sliding off the roof outside. Sarah felt a lump form in her throat. This proximity, this deliberate choice to be near her, felt monumental. She didn't move, didn't reach out. She just looked back at him, into those amber depths that seemed to hold galaxies of unspoken history, marked by that tiny, enigmatic blue. Gray did something small, utterly ordinary, yet it stole Sarah's breath. He slowly, deliberately closed his eyes. Not a blink, a long, slow, deliberate closing of the eyes. He held them shut for a count of 3, then opened them again, looking directly at her. A slow blink, the universal cat sign of trust, of comfort. I see you, and I am not afraid. Sarah felt the tears well up, hot and sudden. Not tears of sadness, not exactly. Tears of something vast and tender and utterly unexpected. Recognition. Connection. A fragile bridge built across snow and silence and grief, plank by cautious plank, affirmed by a single, deliberate blink from a tattooed stray in a borrowed blanket. She didn't dare speak. She didn't move. But slowly, mirroring him, she closed her own eyes, held them shut for a slow count, then opened them, meeting his steady amber gaze. A silent message sent and received. In the warm, quiet sanctuary of the garage, with the snow falling thick and silent outside, the wariness between the woman and the cat didn't vanish, but it softened, warmed, like frost yielding to the first weak rays of a winter sun. The space between them, once an uncrossable chasm, now felt charged with the quiet hum of something new, something fragile and profoundly real. Not complete, but blooming. Winter tightened its grip on Willow Creek. The snow, pristine and deep at first, became crusted, grayed by exhaust and time. It piled in dirty berms along the roads, shrinking the world outside Sarah's windows. Inside the garage, however, a fragile ecosystem of warmth and tentative trust had taken root. Gray was no longer just a shadow behind the workbench. He was a presence, a quiet, watchful fixture in Sarah's daily rhythm. He met her at the side door most mornings now, waiting on his fleecy blanket island near the heater. His eyes, still holding that deep reservoir of weariness, now held a flicker of expectation, recognition, certainly. He'd watch her refill his bowls, his ragged tail giving the faintest twitch, a barely there thump against the blanket. He ate with less urgency, lingering near the plate afterwards, meticulously cleaning his face and paws. Sometimes he'd stretch, a slow, luxurious unfurling revealing the subtle improvement in his condition. The ribs were less stark, his coat, though still rough in places, held a healthier sheen where he groomed. The mud was gone from between his pads. Sarah kept reading aloud. Steinbeck gave way to poetry. Mary Oliver mostly. Words about wild things, about paying attention, about the stubborn persistence of life. Gray seemed to listen. He'd sit or lie on his blanket, eyes half closed, the slow blink coming more frequently. Sometimes he'd watch the play of light through the grimy window, or track dust motes dancing in the heater's warmth. It was peaceful, a balm against the stark silence of the house, against the hollow ache that still resided just beneath Sarah's breastbone when she thought of Mark. She'd started talking to Gray more directly. Not just filling the silence, but sharing. "Remembered something today," she'd say softly, sitting with her back against the wall, a mug of tea warming her hands. "Mark, he used to whistle while he shaved. Terribly off-key. Drove me crazy on Sunday mornings." A ghost of a smile touched her lips. "I'd give anything to hear that racket again." She'd glance at Gray. He'd be watching her, head tilted slightly, amber eyes unreadable but attentive. Silly, isn't it? Missing the annoying things the most. Gray would just blink, slowly. One frigid evening, the wind howling like a banshee around the eaves, Sarah brought her laptop into the garage. The house felt too big, too echoing. Gray was curled tightly on his blanket, a compact ball of gray fur, nose tucked under his tail. The heater hummed its steady song. Sarah settled near the wall, the glow of the screen illuminating her face. She wasn't sure why she did it. Curiosity, perhaps. That persistent little blood. She typed into the search bar, "cat ear tattoo meaning." "Cat ear tattoo identification." Blue.cat. The results were mundane. Mostly about TNR programs, trap, neuter, return. But those tattoos were usually simple lines or notches on the tip of the ear, signifying a sterilized feral cat. Gray's tattoo was different. High on the ear, near the base. A single, distinct, faded blood. Not a clip, not a notch. A deliberate mark. She refined her search, military cat tattoo. Service animal cat identification. Veteran cat tattoo. A few obscure forum threads surfaced. Stories from bases overseas. Mentions of soldiers adopting local strays, sometimes marking them discreetly for identification, especially if the animal wasn't officially sanctioned. A way to claim ownership, to say this one is mine, in the transient chaos of deployment. Sometimes a coded message. Unit identifiers. Blood type. A tiny, hidden declaration. One faded photograph showed a tough-looking soldier cradling a scruffy tabby, a small, dark mark visible high on its ear. The caption read, "Rusty, Camp Leatherneck. Best damn alarm clock I ever had." Sarah stared at the photo, then glanced at Gray, still a sleeping gray mound. A soldier's cat? Left behind? Lost? The idea took root, sending a strange shiver down her spine. It explained the deliberate mark, the wariness that felt trained, not feral, the profound exhaustion that wasn't just from the streets. It felt plausible, a piece clicking into place. She leaned back against the wall, the hum of the laptop mingling with the heater's drone and the wind's moan outside. Gray's story wasn't just hardship. It was displacement, loss on a different scale. The first sign that something deeper was stirring came subtly. It wasn't loud. It was a sound Sarah began to notice in the deep quiet of the night. She'd started sleeping poorly again, the old restlessness returning. Lying awake in the dark, she'd hear it. A faint, rhythmic scritch, scritch, scritch. Coming from the garage. At first, she dismissed it. Mice in the walls? The old house settling? But it was too regular. Too deliberate. Curiosity pulled her out of bed one night. She slipped on her robe and padded silently down the cold hallway, avoiding the creaky floorboards Mark had always meant to fix. She paused at the door leading into the garage, pressing her ear against the wood. Scritch, scritch, scritch. It was clearer now. Dry, persistent. Not frantic, but focused. Like something methodically working at a surface. Sarah's pulse quickened. Gray? What was he doing? She eased the door open a crack, just enough to peer through. The garage was dim, lit only by the faint orange glow of the heater's coils. Gray wasn't on his blanket. He was over by the far wall, the shared wall with the long empty house next door. He was standing on his hind legs, his front paws braced against the old, unpainted drywall. His head was down, focused intently. Scritch, scritch, scritch. His claws, carefully retracted most of the time, were extended, scraping against the surface. Not wildly, not trying to tear through, just scratching. At one specific spot, about a foot off the concrete floor. Over and over and over. Sarah watched, frozen. He wasn't trying to dig out. He wasn't agitated. It was almost ritualistic. A compulsion. He'd scratch for a minute, pause, head cocked as if listening, then start again. Scritch, scritch, scritch. The sound echoed in the stillness, setting Sarah's teeth on edge. It felt laden with meaning she couldn't grasp. Why there? What was behind that wall? Just the empty space of the neighbor's house, cold and dark for years. She remembered the veteran connection she'd pondered. Was this a remnant of training? A stress behavior? Or something else? Something tied to the place he'd come from? She closed the door softly, the sound muffled. Back in bed, the scritch, scritch, scritch seemed louder in her mind, echoing the restless scratching of her own unanswered questions. The peaceful bubble in the garage had developed a hairline crack. It became a nightly ritual. Sarah would hear it. Sometimes she'd go look, peering through the crack in the door. Always the same spot. Always the same methodical, focused scratching. Gray seemed oblivious to her observation, utterly absorbed in his task. During the day, he was his usual self, wary but settled, eating, grooming, listening to her read, blinking slowly. But the nights belonged to that persistent, unsettling sound. Sarah found herself staring at that section of the wall during the day. It looked ordinary, slightly scuffed now, dust disturbed. She ran her fingers over it. Just drywall, cool to the touch. What lay beyond? Just studs? Insulation? The hollow space of the neighboring house? Why did this spot compel him? It began to wear on her. The scratching wasn't just a sound. It was a question she couldn't answer, a mystery scratching at the edges of her own carefully constructed calm. It mirrored her own unresolved grief, the things she couldn't fix, the questions about Mark's last days that still haunted her. The peaceful coexistence started to feel strained. The shared silence now held an undercurrent of this nightly tension. One afternoon, while Gray napped in a patch of weak sunlight near the heater, Sarah did something impulsive. Driven by a need to understand, to do something about the scratching, she grabbed a small step stool and a flashlight. She approached the spot, her heart thudding dully against her ribs. She shone the light on the area Gray focused on. Up close, she could see the fine grooves his claws had made in the paint. She pressed her ear against the wall, listening intently. Silence. Just the faint hum of the heater and Gray's soft breathing behind her. Frustrated, she tapped lightly on the wall. Solid. No echo suggesting a hollow space behind this particular panel. She tapped a few inches to the left. Same solid thud. To the right. Solid. Then, higher up, almost at shoulder height. A different sound. Less dense. Sarah frowned. She tapped again. Tap tap. Definitely a different resonance. She shone the light upwards. The drywall looked seamless. But maybe there had been a repair? A patch? The house was old. She ran her fingers over the area. It felt the same. Smooth, cool paint. She glanced back at Gray. He was awake now, sitting up on his blanket, watching her. His amber eyes were wide, unblinking. His ears were pricked forward, focused entirely on her actions at the wall. There was no fear, but an intense alertness. A stillness that felt charged. "What is it, Gray?" she whispered, her voice sounding too loud in the quiet garage. "What are you trying to tell me?" Gray just stared at her. Then, deliberately, his gaze shifted to the spot on the wall she'd just tapped. The spot that sounded hollow. He held his gaze there for a long moment, then slowly looked back at her. A silent communication. Unmistakable. Sarah's breath hitched. The air felt thick. The scratching wasn't random. It wasn't just stress. He knew something was there. Behind that specific section of wall. Something that resonated differently. Something hidden? The implications crashed over her. Had something been concealed there? By whom? The previous owners of her house? Or could it be connected to the empty house next door? To the veteran Gray might have belonged to? Was this the source of his nightly ritual? Not compulsion, but memory? An attempt to reach what? A wave of unease washed through her, cold despite the heater's warmth. The empty house next door suddenly felt less benign. Less empty. It felt like a silent witness, holding a secret Gray was desperately, wordlessly, trying to uncover. And Sarah, by tapping on the wall, had just acknowledged she'd heard him. She'd stepped into the mystery. Gray continued to watch her, his expression inscrutable. The peaceful trust of the past weeks felt fragile, stretched thin over this new, unsettling tension. The scratching wasn't just a sound in the night anymore. It was a plea, a puzzle. And the wall between Sarah's garage and the forgotten house next door suddenly felt like the thinnest of veils, hiding something that demanded to be found. The quiet rhythm of their shared existence had fractured, replaced by a silent, shared question hanging heavy in the dusty air. What lies beneath? The hollow sound echoed in Sarah's mind long after her knuckles stopped rapping the wall. It reverberated through the fragile piece of the garage, shattering the delicate rhythm she and Gray had established. The space felt different now. Heavy with unspoken history and a secret pressing against thin drywall. Gray watched her, those ancient amber eyes holding a depth of knowing that felt unnerving. He didn't return to his nap. He sat, statue still on his blanket, gaze fixed on her, then flicking pointedly back to the section of wall she'd tapped. The silent communication was deafening. The scratching didn't stop. If anything, Gray's nightly ritual became more intense. Scritch, scritch, scritch. The sound, amplified by Sarah's newfound awareness, scraped against her raw nerves. It wasn't just annoyance. It was a physical manifestation of the unresolved ache within her. Gray's focused desperation mirrored her own buried grief, the questions about Mark's final, pain-filled days she could never ask, the helplessness that had consumed her. The wall became an obsession. During the day, while Gray drowsed in a patch of weak sunlight, Sarah found herself drawn to it. She'd run her fingers over the faint claw marks, press her ear against the cool surface, willing it to speak. She researched drywall repairs, hidden compartments, the history of the two bungalows, built in the 50s, owned by a series of families, nothing remarkable. The veteran connection felt like the only thread, thin but persistent. Was there a soldier, broken by war, who'd lived next door? Who'd hidden something precious or terrible in this shared wall? And Gray, was he the key? Or just another victim caught in the wake? The tension bled into their days. Gray seemed more watchful, less inclined to relax into the slow blinks. He'd startle more easily at sudden sounds. Sarah's readings became halting, distracted. The comforting rhythm of her soft voice faltered. She'd catch herself staring at the wall mid-sentence, losing the thread of the poem, the warmth of the shared moment dissolving into the chill of the unsolved mystery. The trust, so painstakingly built, felt brittle. The space between them, once a bridge, now felt mined with unspoken questions. One bitter night, a week after the tapping incident, the wind screamed around the eaves like a banshee chorus. Sarah lay awake, the old house groaning in protest. The scratching started, louder than usual, more frantic. Scritch, scritch, scritch. It wasn't the methodical sound of before. It was urgent, desperate. Claws catching, tearing. Sarah threw back the covers, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She didn't bother with her robe. She pulled on her thick socks and padded straight to the garage door, the cold floorboards biting through the wool. She flung the door open. The scene hit her like a physical blow. Gray wasn't just scratching. He was attacking the wall. He stood on his hind legs, front paws braced high, claws fully extended, raking down the drywall with frantic, powerful strokes. Dust and tiny flecks of paint puffed into the air, illuminated by the heater's dull orange glow. A low, guttural sound rumbled in his throat, not a growl, not a meow, but a sound of pure, primal effort. His muscles strained, his ragged fur bristling along his spine. He was utterly focused, consumed by the task, oblivious to her presence. "Gray, stop!" Sarah's voice cracked, sharp with fear and shock. She took a step forward. He didn't stop. He didn't even flinch. He just redoubled his efforts, ripping at the wall with a ferocity she'd never seen in him. Scritch, scritch, thunk. A different sound. Not just drywall tearing. Something had given way behind it. A splintering crack. Sarah acted without thought. The sight of him, this creature she'd come to care for, lost in this frenzy, collided violently with the months of her own helplessness, her own bottled-up rage at the unfairness of Mark's death, at the suffocating silence, at this wall standing between her and something. Understanding? Release? She lunged forward, not towards Gray, but towards the corner of the garage where Mark's old tools lay gathering dust. Her hand closed around the cold, familiar wooden handle of his claw hammer. "Move, Gray." Her voice was raw, commanding. Startled by her sudden movement and tone, Gray finally stopped. He dropped to all fours, panting, sides heaving, eyes wide and wild, fixed on the hammer in her hand. He backed up a step, a low warning rumble vibrating in his chest, but he didn't flee to his shadows. He watched her, trembling, the whites showing around his amber irises. Sarah didn't hesitate. The dam inside her had burst. Months of carefully controlled grief, of polite numbness, of carrying the weight of absence, erupted. It wasn't just about the wall anymore. It was about smashing through the barriers around her own heart. She raised the hammer. The weight felt alien, yet terrifyingly right. She aimed not at the spot Gray had scratched, but slightly higher, at the place where her tap had sounded hollow. Where the resonance had been different. She swung. The sound was shockingly loud in the enclosed space, reverberating off the concrete floor and metal shelves. A jagged hole punched through the drywall, sending a puff of dust and insulation fibers into the air. Gray flinched violently but held his ground, a high-pitched sound escaping him. Sarah swung again. Another hole connecting to the first. She swung a third time, thwack, tearing away a jagged chunk of drywall about the size of her hand. She dropped the hammer. It clattered loudly on the concrete. Her chest heaved. Her hand stung. Dust motes danced crazily in the heater's light. She stepped closer, peering into the dark cavity revealed behind the broken wall. The heater's glow barely penetrated the gloom. She fumbled for the flashlight she'd left near the step stool days before, her hands shaking violently. She clicked it on. The bright beam cut through the swirling dust. Behind the drywall, nestled between the wooden studs, wasn't just insulation. Tucked against the shared wall with the neighboring house, wrapped in a layer of faded oil-stained canvas, was a small, rectangular metal box. Army green. Dented. Rust spotting its corners. It looked like an old ammunition box, the kind soldiers might use for personal effects. Sarah's breath caught. Her knees felt weak. She reached in, her fingers brushing against the cold, gritty metal. It was heavier than it looked. She carefully pulled it free from its dusty tomb, dislodging clumps of pink insulation. She cradled it in her arms, the cold seeping through her thin pajamas. She turned, slowly, sinking down onto the cold concrete floor, her back against the scarred wall. The box rested in her lap. Gray was there. Instantly. He didn't approach the box. He approached her. He padded right up to her bent knees, his nose twitching at the scent of old metal and dust. He looked from the box to her face. His wild panic seemed to have vanished, replaced by an intense, quiet focus. He sat down, his thin body pressed against her shin, his warmth a startling contrast to the cold box. He didn't purr. He didn't make a sound. He just leaned. His head tilted, those impossibly old eyes fixed on hers, watching the tears that had begun to spill silently down Sarah's cheeks. Tears she hadn't even felt starting. She hadn't cried like this since the early days after Mark died. Not the controlled, quiet tears, but the deep, shuddering sobs that racked her body, born of exhaustion, shock, and the overwhelming pressure of release. She cried for Mark, for the future stolen, for the unbearable loneliness. She cried for Gray, for the hardship etched into his bones, for whatever loss had driven him to this desperate act. She cried for the soldier who had hidden this box, whose story was now tangled with theirs. The tears were hot, messy, unstoppable. And Gray, he didn't move away. He didn't flinch at her shaking. He pressed closer. He lifted a single, hesitant paw. Not to bat at the box, but to rest it gently, lightly, on her forearm where it cradled the cold metal. The touch was tentative, the pads of his paw rough against her skin. A grounding weight, a silent, profound gesture of solidarity. I'm here. I see your pain. You are not alone. He held his paw there, his gaze unwavering, steady as an anchor in her storm. His amber eyes, reflecting the flashlight beam still clutched in her other hand, held no judgment. Only a deep, shared understanding of loss. Of the need to tear down walls, both physical and emotional. The blue dot on his ear, caught in the light, seemed to gleam, a tiny, hard-won badge of survival, of a history now irrevocably linked to hers. Sarah leaned her head back against the broken wall, the rough edges of drywall scraping her scalp. She let the tears flow, her body shaking, Gray's small paw a constant, warm pressure on her arm. The cold metal box in her lap felt like a lead weight, a promise and a threat. The scratching had stopped. The wall was broken. The secret was unearthed. And in the raw, dust-filled aftermath, amidst the wreckage of drywall and the flood of her own grief, Sarah felt a profound shift. Not peace, not yet, but a strange, exhausted clarity. The burden hadn't vanished, but it was no longer hers alone to carry. She looked down at Gray, his gaze still locked on hers, his presence a solid comfort against her leg. The mystery hadn't ended. It had just begun. But the wall between them, the wall of silence and fear and unspoken pain, that wall had finally crumbled. Not because she'd solved the puzzle of the box, but because, in breaking through the plaster and laugh, she'd finally allowed herself to break open too. And the ragged, tattooed creature beside her hadn't run from the wreckage. It stayed, paw on her arm, witness to the breaking, partner in the aftermath. The cold garage, filled with dust and the scent of old secrets, suddenly felt like the most honest place she'd been in months. The climax wasn't the discovery, it was the shared, shattered moment of raw connection that followed. The tears, the trembling, the small, steady paw offering silent comfort in the ruins. The dust settled. Literally. Fine, white particles drifted in the beam of the flashlight Sarah still clutched, finally lowered to the concrete floor beside her. The jagged hole in the garage wall gaped like a wound, exposing splintered wood and tufts of pink insulation. The cold metal box, army green and heavy with secrets, rested solidly in her lap. Gray's paw remained a warm, grounding weight on her forearm, his amber eyes reflecting the dim light, holding hers through the fading tremors of her tears. Silence descended, thick and profound. Not the suffocating silence of before, but a different kind. A silence heavy with release, with exhaustion, with the sheer, overwhelming weight of what lay uncovered. The frantic energy that had consumed both of them, Gray's desperate scratching, Sarah's furious hammering, had bled out, leaving behind a hollowed-out calm. The storm had passed, leaving wreckage and revelation in its wake. Slowly, gently, Sarah lifted her free hand. She didn't reach for the box. She reached for Gray. Her fingers, still trembling slightly, brushed the rough fur between his ears. He didn't flinch. He didn't pull away. He leaned infinitesimally into the touch, the barest pressure against her fingertips. A silent affirmation. We are here. Together. His slow blink was deliberate, deep. An anchor in the stillness. They sat like that for a long time, woman and cat on the cold concrete floor, back against the broken wall, surrounded by the evidence of their shared breaking point. The heater hummed its familiar, steady song, a counterpoint to the ragged edges of Sarah's breathing as it slowly evened out. The wind still howled outside, but it felt distant now, muffled by the enormity of the space between them, irrevocably changed. Sarah's gaze drifted from Gray's watchful eyes to the box in her lap. Its surface was gritty with dust and flecks of drywall. Rust bloomed at the corners like dried blood. It felt alien, heavy with a history she wasn't sure she was ready to shoulder. Was this Gray's past? A soldier's hidden treasure? Or something darker? The questions swirled, but the frantic urgency was gone, replaced by a bone-deep weariness and a strange sense of responsibility. This box, unearthed by Gray's insistent memory and her own explosive grief, was now hers. She didn't open it. Not then. The moment felt too raw, too sacred in its shared devastation. Opening it felt like trespassing on a grief not yet her own. Instead, she carefully shifted, sliding the box off her lap and placing it gently on the floor beside her. Gray watched the movement, his head tilting, but he didn't investigate the box. His focus remained on her, as if assuring himself she was still present, still grounded. Getting to her feet felt like climbing a mountain. Every muscle protested. Her hands stung from gripping the hammer. She felt scraped raw, emotionally and physically. She looked at the hole in the wall, the scattered debris, the dropped hammer. A mess. a tangible manifestation of the inner chaos she'd finally unleashed. But looking down at Gray, sitting calmly beside the green box, his gaze steady, she didn't feel regret. She felt cleansed. Exhausted, yes, but lighter. As if a pressure valve had been blown wide open. The next few days unfolded in a haze of quiet reorientation. Sarah cleaned up the garage. She swept the dust and drywall fragments, carefully stacking the larger broken pieces. She didn't patch the hole. Not yet. It felt necessary. A reminder. A portal. She placed the army green box on a cleared shelf near Mark's old workbench, beside a dusty jar of mismatched screws. It sat there, a silent, enigmatic presence. Gray's behavior shifted subtly, profoundly. The nightly scratching ceased completely. The frantic, haunted energy that had sometimes flickered in his eyes seemed to dissipate. He was calmer, more present. He spent longer periods out in the open, no longer tethered to the safety of the blanket behind the workbench. He explored the garage more thoroughly, sniffing at tools, investigating corners he'd previously ignored, his movements unhurried, almost contemplative. The biggest change was his proximity to Sarah. He no longer maintained the careful 3-foot buffer. He'd weave around her legs as she refilled his water bowl. He'd settle on his blanket while she sat nearby, reading, and sometimes he'd simply get up and walk over. He'd sit beside her chair, close enough that his fur brushed her leg. Or he'd lie down near her feet, tucking his paws under him, watching her with those calm, knowing eyes. Once, while she was lost in thought, staring at the green box on the shelf, she felt a soft pressure against her hand resting on the arm of the chair. She looked down. Gray had gently butted his head against her knuckles. Not demanding attention, just touching, connecting. A silent "I'm here." The trust wasn't just deeper, it was foundational. The wall between them hadn't just been crossed, it had been demolished. They had seen each other's rawest selves, Gray in his desperate clawing at the past, Sarah in her furious eruption of grief. And neither had turned away. That shared breaking had forged a bond thicker than blood, quieter than words. Sarah found herself talking to Gray differently. Less filling the silence, more sharing reflections. Sitting in the garage one afternoon, weak winter sunlight finally piercing the weeks of Gray, she watched Gray meticulously clean a paw. The blue dot on his ear caught the light. "You knew, didn't you?" she said softly, her voice still a little rough from disuse. "You knew something was there. Buried." Gray paused his grooming, looked at her, blinked slowly. "Was it his? Your soldiers?" She didn't expect an answer. She was talking to herself as much as to him. Why did he hide it? Why did he leave you? The old questions, but the desperation was gone. Replaced by a quiet sadness, a profound empathy for the unknown man whose life had intersected with theirs through this scarred, resilient creature. She started researching again. Not frantically, but with a focused curiosity. She looked deeper into veteran support networks, PTSD in animals, stories of soldiers and the strays they befriended in war zones. She learned about the invisible wounds, the struggle to return, the bonds formed in extremity that could be as hard to leave behind as a limb. The idea of Gray as a battle buddy, a silent witness to trauma, solidified. That tiny blue tattoo wasn't just ownership, it was a lifeline. A silent declaration. This one is mine. Remember me. She imagined the soldier, perhaps broken by things he'd seen, finding solace in this scruffy cat, marking him as a talisman against the darkness, only to lose him or leave him behind. The thought brought a fresh wave of sorrow, but it was clean sorrow. shared sorrow. Her own grief for Mark shifted too. It was still there, the hollow ache beneath her ribs. But it no longer felt like a crushing weight. It felt integrated. A part of her landscape, like the old maple tree in the yard. She could look at his reading glasses on the side table without the sharp stab of pain. She could pick up his favorite mug and feel a warmth, a memory, instead of just absence. Talking to Gray about him felt less like reopening a wound and more like tending a memory garden. "He would have liked you, Gray," she said one morning, watching the cat delicately lap water. "Stubborn, quiet, loyal." Gray paused, looked up at her, water dripping from his whiskers, and gave one slow, deliberate blink. "I know." The routines of their days took on a new rhythm, infused with a quiet peace. Mornings still started in the garage, but Gray often followed her back into the kitchen now, sitting regally on the linoleum while she made coffee, observing her domestic rituals with detached interest. He'd retreat to his garage sanctuary for naps, but sometimes, on particularly cold afternoons, Sarah would find him curled on the rug near the living room radiator, a silent, gray comma of contentment. He never ventured far into the house, respecting some invisible boundary, but his presence in the warmer spaces felt like a tentative expansion of their shared territory. Meals were shared rituals. Sarah ate at the small kitchen table. Gray ate his pâté from his ceramic dish on the floor nearby. The silence was companionable, punctuated by the clink of cutlery and the soft sounds of Gray eating. Evenings often found them back in the garage, the heater humming, Sarah reading aloud, poetry again, or sometimes just the newspaper. Gray would be on his blanket, or sometimes, bravely, on the footrest of Sarah's chair, a warm weight against her ankles. The hole in the wall remained. Sarah would sometimes catch Gray looking at it, not with agitation, but with a quiet recognition, as if acknowledging the place where the past had bled into the present. One late February afternoon, a surprise thaw softened the crusted snow. Sarah stood at the kitchen window washing dishes. The weak sun glinted off the melting white blanket in the yard. Movement caught her eye. Near the rusted wheelbarrow, where she'd first seen him months ago, stood Gray. He wasn't skulking. He was sitting upright, facing the empty house next door. His posture was relaxed, alert. The winter's sun caught his fur, revealing hints of silver and charcoal she hadn't noticed before. His ribs were no longer stark ridges. He looked solid, healthier. And high on his left ear, the tiny blue tattoo stood out, a deliberate mark of survival against the weathered fur. He sat like that for a long time, perfectly still, gazing at the silent structure. Not with longing, Sarah thought. Not with fear, but with an acknowledgement, a quiet farewell? Or perhaps a simple recognition of the place where his old life had ended, and this unexpected new one had begun. After a while, he stood, stretched languidly, and turned. He padded across the slushy yard, not with his old stiff-legged caution, but with a loose, confident gait. He jumped onto the back porch, nosed open the slightly ajar door Sarah kept for him now, and disappeared inside. Sarah watched him go, her hands still in the soapy water. She looked back at the empty spot near the wheelbarrow, then at the melting snow revealing patches of dormant, muddy earth. The hollow ache was still there, a familiar companion. But layered over it was warmth, connection, purpose. The silence in the house wasn't emptiness anymore. It was the space filled by Gray's soft breathing from the living room rug, by the hum of the refrigerator, by the drip of melting snow outside. It was the quiet hum of life, moving forward. She dried her hands and walked slowly to the garage. She stood before the shelf where the army green box sat, She didn't touch it. She simply looked at it. The rust, the dents, the layer of dust it had already begun to reacquire. It was still a mystery. A closed door. But the frantic need to force it open had subsided. It would reveal its secrets, or it wouldn't, in its own time. The choice to open it, or not, was hers. And Gray's. They would decide together. Sarah reached out, not for the box, but to run a finger along the rough edge of the hole in the wall. The broken drywall, the exposed studs. It wasn't pretty. It was a scar. But it was their scar. A testament to the breaking that had led to this fragile, hard-won piece. She thought of that first day, the weeping rain, the bone-deep exhaustion in those amber eyes mirroring her own. She thought of the shared silence, the slow blinks, the frantic scratching, the hammer swinging in the dark, the tears on the cold floor, the small paw resting on her arm. She turned away from the wall and the box. She walked back towards the kitchen door. Gray was there, sitting just inside the threshold, waiting. He looked up at her, tilted his head, and gave one slow, deliberate blink. Warmth spread through Sarah's chest, radiating outwards, melting the last internal patches of frost. The journey wasn't over. The box waited. But here now, in the quiet aftermath, with the winter slowly loosening its grip and this scarred, tattooed creature blinking trust up at her, Sarah felt something she hadn't dared hope for in a long, long time. Not happiness, perhaps. Not yet. But something just as vital. A quiet, resilient peace, built on broken walls and shared tears, warming her from the inside out like the steady hum of the garage heater against the lingering chill. The beginning felt like a lifetime ago, shrouded in rain and grief. Now, standing in the doorway between the garage and the house, with Gray's gaze holding hers, Sarah understood. The hollow ache hadn't vanished. It had simply made space. Space for this. Spring arrived in Willow Creek not with a fanfare, but with a slow, determined seep. The crusted snow surrendered to mud and then, miraculously, to patches of defiant green. Crocuses, tiny purple and yellow soldiers, pushed through the thawing earth near Sarah's porch. The air lost its knife edge, carrying instead the damp, fecund scent of renewal. Inside the bungalow, the quiet hum held a new quality. Not just Gray's presence, but a settled warmth, a rhythm of shared existence. The army green box remained on the garage shelf. Sarah dusted it occasionally, her fingers tracing the cold metal, the rough patches of rust. It was a presence, a silent monument to the breaking point that had forged their deeper bond. She felt no urgency to open it, only a quiet respect for the unknown story it held. Opening it felt like a threshold she wasn't ready to cross alone. It belonged to Gray's past, and somehow, their shared present. Gray, too, seemed content to let it be. He no longer stared at the hole in the wall with intensity, only a passing acknowledgement, like glancing at an old scar. His world had expanded. He now spent most of his days indoors, following Sarah with a quiet devotion that was both comforting and profound. He had his routines, a sunbeam on the living room rug in the late morning, a vigilant watch from the kitchen windowsill as Sarah worked in her nascent garden, evenings curled on the footrest of her reading chair in the garage, the heater still humming against the lingering chill of the concrete floor. The wariness was still there, a fundamental part of him, but it was layered over with a deep, hard-won trust. He accepted gentle scratches behind his ears, leaning into her hand with a soft, rumbling purr that was barely audible, more a vibration felt through his fur than a sound. The blue dot on his ear was simply part of him now, a badge not just of survival, but of belonging. One soft April afternoon, the kind where the air felt like silk and the birdsong was a constant, joyous chorus. Sarah sat at her small kitchen table. Gray was perched on the windowsill, watching a robin hop across the greening lawn, his tail twitching with mild, predatory interest. Sarah was sorting through a box of old photographs she'd finally gathered the courage to open, pictures of her and Mark, laughing on a beach, arms slung around each other at a family barbecue, Mark looking absurdly proud beside his perpetually unfinished lawnmower project in the garage. The ache was there, familiar as her own breath, but it was a clean ache now. It held love, not just loss. She paused at a photo taken in this very kitchen years ago. Mark, younger, his hair thicker, was grinning as he attempted to flip a pancake, batter splattered comically on the stovetop. Sarah was caught mid-laugh, her hand reaching out, probably to rescue the doomed pancake. The sheer, uncomplicated joy in the image caught her off guard. She hadn't laughed like that in so long. A wave of gratitude washed over her, sharp and sweet. Gratitude for the time they'd had, for the love that still resonated in these faded colors. Gray, perhaps sensing the shift in her stillness, hopped down from the windowsill. He patted across the linoleum and rubbed his head gently against her ankle. She reached down, scratching the spot he loved just below his jaw. He leaned into it, purring audibly now, a soft, rhythmic rumble. He was ridiculous, wasn't he? Sarah murmured, holding the photo so Gray could see, though she knew he wouldn't understand the image. Always trying something new, usually making a mess. She traced Mark's laughing face with her fingertip. But he made me laugh. Every single day. Gray nudged her hand with his head, then turned and patted purposefully towards the door leading to the garage. He stopped, looked back at her, and gave a soft, distinct emoji. It wasn't a demand. It was an invitation. An urging. Curious, Sarah stood. Gray led the way, tail held high like a banner. He walked straight to the shelf where the green box sat. He sat down in front of it, looking from the box to Sarah, then back again. His amber eyes held a quiet insistence she hadn't seen directed at the box before. Not agitation, but readiness. A sense that it was time. Sarah's heart thudded once, heavily, against her ribs. The peaceful rhythm of their days paused. She looked at Gray, at his calm, expectant posture. He blinked slowly. Trust me. The message was clear. He wasn't pushing her towards the unknown past alone. He was standing beside her, ready to face it with her. Okay, Gray, she whispered, her voice thick. Okay. She lifted the box from the shelf. It felt heavier than before, charged with potential. She carried it not back to the house, but to Mark's old workbench in the garage. Gray followed, leaping lightly onto the sturdy wooden surface, sitting beside the box like a silent sentinel. The weak spring sunlight slanted through the grimy window, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air. Sarah took a deep, steadying breath. The scent of dust, old wood oil, and Gray's clean fur filled her lungs. She ran her fingers over the simple metal latch. It was stiff, corroded. She needed pliers from Mark's toolbox to finally wrench it open. The lid resisted, then gave with a protesting creak of old hinges. Inside, nestled in the oil-stained canvas wrapping, wasn't treasure nor horror. It was history. Personal, poignant history. First, a small bundle of letters, tied with a faded blue ribbon. The paper was thin, creased from repeated folding. The handwriting on the envelopes was neat, feminine. Sergeant Daniel J. Miller, with various APO addresses. Letters from home. From someone named Maggie. Beneath them, a worn leather wallet. Inside, a faded Illinois driver's license confirmed the name, Daniel James Miller. The photo showed a young man, maybe early 20s, with close-cropped hair, a serious expression, but kindness in his eyes. There was a creased photo tucked behind the license, Daniel, looking younger, maybe high school age, arms slung around an older couple who shared his kind eyes. His parents, Sarah guessed. A small St. Christopher medal on a broken chain. Then, the most telling items, a set of dog tags. Miller, Daniel J., followed by his service number, blood type, and religion. The cold metal felt heavy, imbued with the weight of service. And finally, tucked carefully beneath everything, a small, laminated card. It was a unit photo. A group of soldiers in fatigues, looking weary but grinning, arms around each other in front of a dusty, sand-colored building. And there, sitting calmly in the lap of a young soldier near the center, unmistakable even in the faded image, was a gray tabby cat. High on its left ear, visible despite the poor resolution, was a tiny, dark. Sarah's breath hitched. She carefully lifted the laminated card. The soldier holding the cat was Daniel Miller. He looked younger than in his license photo, his face thinner, his eyes holding a hint of the ancient weariness Sarah had first seen in Gray's. But he was smiling down at the cat in his lap with unmistakable affection. The cat gazed steadily at the camera, its posture relaxed, trusting. Gray leaned forward. He sniffed at the laminated photo. Not casually, intently. His nose brushed the image of the younger cat, of the young soldier. He made a soft sound, almost a sigh. Then, slowly, deliberately, he butted his head against Sarah's hand that held the card. A gesture of recognition, of profound, wordless knowing. Sarah traced the face of the young soldier in the photo. Daniel Miller. She looked at Gray, sitting beside her on the workbench, his amber eyes fixed on hers. The connection was undeniable. The blood, the weariness, the loyalty. The soldier who had found solace in a stray, marked him as his own in a war zone, only to become separated. But had Daniel come home? Was he still out there, somewhere? Or was this box, hidden in the wall of the house next door, a house that had stood empty for years before Sarah arrived, his final message? Hidden perhaps in a moment of crisis, of despair, intending to retrieve it, and never returning? The questions swirled, but the frantic need for definitive answers had dissolved. The gift wasn't closure in the sense of knowing Daniel Miller's ultimate fate. The gift was him. The confirmation of Gray's story. The validation of the profound bond that had existed between a lost soldier and a lost cat. The gift was seeing the young man who had once held this creature with such tenderness. The gift was the tangible proof of the love and loyalty Gray had carried across oceans and years, etched in his very being and marked by a tiny blue. Tears blurred Sarah's vision again, but they were different tears. Tears of reverence. Of shared sorrow for Daniel Miller's unknown journey. Of awe for Gray's enduring spirit. She carefully placed the laminated photo on the workbench where Gray could see it clearly. He settled down beside it, resting his chin on his paws, his gaze fixed on the image of his younger self and the soldier. His breathing was slow, deep. A quiet vigil. Sarah gathered the other items, the letters, the wallet, the dog tags. They weren't hers. They belonged to Daniel Miller. To his story. To whatever family might still be wondering. Holding the dog tags, the cold metal warming against her palm, she knew what she needed to do. It wasn't just about curiosity anymore. It was about responsibility. About honoring the bond she now understood. about giving back a piece of a story that had intersected so dramatically with her own. She wouldn't pry into Maggie's letters. They weren't meant for her. But Daniel Miller deserved to be remembered. His family, if they existed, deserved to know what had become of him, or at least what had become of these fragments of his life. And Gray deserved to have the loyalty he'd carried for so long acknowledged, his soldier's memory honored. Later that evening, Sarah sat at her small desk in the living room. Gray was curled on the rug nearby, watching the last light fade outside. The photo of Daniel Miller holding the young Gray sat beside her computer screen. She navigated to a Veterans Affairs website, then to a missing persons database. She took another deep breath, the scent of the warm spring evening drifting through the slightly open window. She picked up Daniel Miller's dog tags, the metal clicking softly. She began to type, a careful, respectful inquiry, not demanding answers, but offering information. I believe I may have found personal effects belonging to Sergeant Daniel James Miller. She described the box, its contents, the location where it was found. She mentioned the unit photo, the dog tags. She did not mention Gray. Not yet. That felt too personal, too intertwined with her own story. This was about Daniel. As she typed, detailing the Illinois license, the name Maggie on the letters, a sense of quiet purpose settled over her. It wasn't about fixing the past. It was about stitching a thread of connection back into the fabric of a broken story. It was about completing a circle Gray had carried for so long. The act felt sacred. A final gift, not to her, but through her. A gift from Gray's past to Daniel Miller's future, whatever that might hold. She hit send. The email whooshed away into the digital ether. A message in a bottle, cast onto a vast sea of bureaucracy and forgotten records. She had no guarantee it would find its mark. But she'd done what felt right. What felt necessary. She leaned back in her chair. Gray uncurled and stretched, padding silently over to her. He placed his front paws on her knee, looking up at her, his eyes reflecting the glow of the computer screen. She stroked his head, her fingers finding the familiar spot behind his ear, brushing the tiny blood. "We tried, Gray," she murmured. "We tried to send a piece of him home." Gray leaned into her touch, his purr resonating through her hand, a soft, steady rumble in the quiet room. He looked towards the desk, at the photo of Daniel Miller, then back up at Sarah. He gave one slow, deliberate blink. It held a universe of understanding, of shared effort, of a long vigil, perhaps, finally shared. Sarah picked up the photo of Daniel and the young Gray. She walked across the room to the small bookshelf where she kept the photo of her and Mark laughing over the pancake disaster. She placed the soldier and his cat beside it. Two moments of connection. Two lives marked by love and loss. Two stories, now forever intertwined by a ragged gray cat with a blue-dotted ear and an unshakable loyalty that had spanned continents and crossed the threshold of her own broken heart. Gray jumped onto the sofa beside the bookshelf. He sat, looking at the two photos side by side. The past and the present. The lost and the found. He didn't seem sad. He seemed settled. As if a silent weight, carried for so long it had become part of him, had finally been gently laid down. Not forgotten, but shared, honored. Sarah sat beside him, the warmth of his body pressing against her leg. The computer screen dimmed. Outside, the first fireflies of the season blinked in the gathering dusk. The house was quiet, but the silence was rich, full of memory, full of the soft sound of Gray's breathing, full of the echo of a young soldier's smile and the enduring loyalty of a cat who had never truly forgotten. The final gift wasn't the contents of the box. It was the understanding, the connection, the quiet act of bearing witness and reaching back across time. It was the realization that some scars, like the blue dot on Gray's ear, weren't just wounds. They were maps. Stories written on the skin, waiting for the right moment and the right heart to be read. Summer arrived in Willow Creek like a sigh of relief. The air hummed with cicadas, thick and warm, carrying the scent of cut grass and blooming honeysuckle from Mrs. Henderson's fence next door. The harsh angles of winter memory had softened under the generous sun. Sarah's garden, once a neglected patch, now burst with defiant color, cheerful zinnias, sturdy tomato plants heavy with green fruit, fragrant basil that perfumed the kitchen air. Life, tenacious and vibrant, had taken root. The hole in the garage wall was finally patched. Not perfectly, Sarah wasn't a drywall expert, but smoothly enough. Painted over in a clean, fresh white, it was now just another part of the wall, a scar healed but not forgotten. The army green box was gone. Weeks after her email had vanished into the digital void, a polite, formal response had arrived from the Veterans Affairs office. They acknowledged receipt, confirmed Daniel James Miller's service record, and stated they would attempt to locate next of kin using the information provided. There was no fanfare, no sudden revelation. Just the quiet machinery of bureaucracy turning, slowly, somewhere far away. Sarah hadn't waited. The weight of Daniel Miller's life, condensed into that small metal box, wasn't hers to hold indefinitely. Guided by a quiet certainty that felt like Gray's approval, a slow blink as she packed the items carefully, she had gathered everything except the laminated unit photo. The letters tied with a faded blue ribbon, the worn leather wallet holding the license and the picture of Daniel's parents, the Street Christopher medal, the dog tags. She wrapped them all in fresh tissue paper, placed them in a sturdy cardboard box, and addressed it meticulously, using the return address on Maggie's oldest letter. She included a simple note, written on plain paper. "Dear Maggie, I found these items hidden in the house next door to mine in Willow Creek. I believe they belonged to Daniel. I thought you should have them. I'm so very sorry. Sincerely, a neighbor." She didn't sign her full name. She didn't mention Gray. That story felt too intertwined with her own healing, too precious to share with a stranger, even one connected to Daniel's heart. She dropped the package at the post office, the clerk slapping a flurry of stamps onto it. Watching it disappear onto the conveyor belt felt like releasing a bird, a prayer sent winging towards an unknown destination. Closure wasn't about knowing if Maggie received it or what she felt. Closure was the act itself, the honoring, the returning. The laminated photo of Daniel and the young Gray remained. Sarah had bought a simple wooden frame for it. It sat now on the bookshelf, not beside the pancake photo of her and Mark, but in its own space of quiet reverence. A small, framed testament to a love story that had crossed oceans and ended in separation, yet whose echoes had rippled out to mend another broken heart years later. Gray would sometimes sit before it, gazing silently at the younger version of himself held securely in the soldier's lap. He never seemed sad. Contemplative, perhaps. Acknowledging, as if assuring that younger self, "We were loved. We are remembered." Gray himself was a creature transformed by the summer sun and the solidity of belonging. His coat, now regularly brushed by Sarah, had lost its raggedness, gleaming silver and charcoal. He'd filled out, moving with a loose, confident grace through the house and garden. The wariness was still a fundamental layer. The slam of a car door could still send him diving under the sofa, but it was overlaid with profound trust. He claimed sunbeams on the rug, supervised Sarah's gardening from a shady perch on the porch steps, and had developed a particular fondness for sleeping on the freshly laundered towels in the linen cupboard, leaving drifts of silver fur as his signature. His most cherished spot, however, was the footrest of Sarah's reading chair in the living room. Evenings often found them there, Sarah lost in a book, Gray a warm, purring weight against her ankles. The sound of his purr, once a rare, barely there vibration, was now a deep, contented rumble, a constant bass note to the quiet symphony of their shared life. He'd lift his head occasionally, blinking slowly at her, a silent all is well. The blue dot on his ear was simply part of his landscape now, a unique marker, a story etched in skin. Sarah's own landscape had shifted irrevocably. The crushing weight of Mark's absence hadn't vanished, it had metamorphosed. It was no longer a hollow void threatening to swallow her whole. It had become a deep, quiet chamber within her heart, a space where love resided alongside loss. She could talk about him now, to Gray, to the empty air, even to Mrs. Henderson over the fence, without the words catching like shards of glass in her throat. The memories brought smiles, wistful sometimes, but genuine. She'd even started tackling small projects Mark had left unfinished, not the garage workshop, that still felt too vast, but fixing the leaky faucet, finally repainting the peeling back door a cheerful yellow. Each small completion felt like a whisper to him. See? I'm figuring it out. One warm August evening, Sarah sat on her back porch steps, sipping iced tea. The fireflies were putting on their show, tiny lanterns winking in and out of existence in the deepening twilight. Gray sat beside her, alert, tracking the elusive lights with his keen eyes, his tail giving an occasional twitch. The scent of honeysuckle was overpoweringly sweet. She watched him, this quiet, resilient creature who had appeared like a phantom in her rain-soaked grief. He hadn't replaced Mark. Nothing could. But Gray had done something else, something equally profound. He had reminded her that her heart wasn't a museum dedicated solely to loss. It was still a living, beating organ, capable of expanding, of making space for new connections, new forms of love. He had been a bridge back to herself, back to the world. His story, intertwined with Daniel Miller's, had taught her about the invisible threads that connect lives. How grief can travel across continents, carried in the weary eyes of a stray cat. How a small act of kindness, a saucer of tuna on a cold step, could unravel a hidden history and mend two fractured worlds. How loyalty could be a silent, enduring force, marked by something as simple as a blue dot on a ragged ear. It was about the veterans, yes, the Daniels of the world, carrying unseen burdens, sometimes finding solace in the unlikeliest companions. It was about the quiet heroes like Maggie, waiting, loving from afar. It was about the overlooked souls, the strays, the forgotten, the people and creatures living just beyond the edges of our busy vision, carrying stories that could change everything if we only paused to see. But mostly, Sarah realized, looking at Gray's profile silhouetted against the fireflies, it was about the fundamental human and feline need for connection. The way loneliness, in its many forms, can be a silent epidemic. The way a shared look, a slow blink, a bowl of food offered without expectation, could be the first fragile stitch in mending a torn spirit. Gray hadn't just needed food and shelter. He'd needed a witness. Someone to see his history etched in his eyes and his ear, to acknowledge his loss, to offer sanctuary not just for his body, but for his unspoken story. And Sarah, in her own profound loneliness, had needed exactly the same thing. Gray turned his head, catching her gaze. the fireflies reflected in his amber eyes like distant stars. He blinked slowly. "I see you." Sarah blinked back, slowly, deliberately. "I see you too." The message wasn't complicated. It wasn't wrapped in platitudes. It was the quiet truth learned in a dusty garage, witnessed by a hole in a wall and a cold metal box, affirmed by a purr against her ankles and a blue under her fingertips. We are not meant to be islands. Our pain, our history, our silent struggles, they are not burdens to bear alone in the dark. Connection is the antidote. It's found in the stray shivering in your yard, in the veteran sitting quietly on a park bench, in the neighbor you've never really spoken to, in the shared silence with a creature who speaks a different language but understands the heart. It requires only the courage to look beyond our own walls, to offer a simple kindness, to be present, to see and to be seen. Sarah reached out, scratching the spot behind Gray's ear, her fingers brushing the tiny blue tattoo. It was no longer just a mark of ownership or loss. It was a witness mark, a testament to survival, a symbol of a bond forged in shared loneliness and the quiet, enduring power of finding each other in the dark. It was the map of a journey neither had chosen, but had navigated together, arriving, scarred but whole, in this moment of fireflies and deep, abiding peace. Gray leaned into her touch, his purr deepening, a resonant vibration against the warm night air. The last of the light faded, turning the world into shades of blue and indigo. The fireflies danced on. The silence was rich, full, and utterly complete. It held the echo of a soldier's smile, the ghost of a husband's laugh, the soft rumble of a cat's contentment, and the quiet, unshakable understanding that sometimes salvation comes with 4 paws, a pair of ancient eyes, and a story waiting patiently in the rain to be found. Sarah took a deep breath, the scent of honeysuckle and warm fur filling her lungs. She wasn't just surviving anymore. She was living. And the quiet creature beside her, marked by a blue dot and an ocean of resilience, was living proof that even the most broken things can mend, finding beauty not in spite of their scars, but woven through them, stronger for the breaking. The stories waiting outside your door are real. The quiet heroes, the overlooked souls, the silent histories whispering in the rain, they're everywhere. This one found Sarah. Whose story will find you? If this journey with Sarah and Gray moved you, if it reminded you of the invisible threads connecting us all, please do something. Subscribe for more real, human stories of resilience, unexpected connections, and the quiet magic found in everyday lives. We find them everywhere, and share them here. Share this story. Tag someone who needs this message today. Let's spread the reminder to look closer, to listen harder, to be the sanctuary someone might desperately need. Comment below. Tell us what resonated most. Did you have a Gray? A moment where a simple connection changed everything? Your stories fuel ours. Press the bell icon. Get notified every time we post a new story. Because hope, healing, and second chances deserve to be heard. Daily doses of real-life magic await. The world is full of unseen stories. Hit subscribe and let's discover the next one, together. Your support helps us find them. Thank you for watching and for seeing.